Good morning. Hey, it's Mrs. Ballot. We are going to be doing Chapter 6, Lesson 4 notes today. And so you essentially only have two objectives. The first one being to identify types of synovial joints and describe the movement that each joint allows. And then you need to know the names for some of those movements. So the movements are flexion, extension, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, abduction, adduction, inversion, eversion, supination, pronation, circumduction, rotation, retraction, and protraction. Now there is a whole separate PowerPoint in Schoology for this. The PowerPoint that was sent from the company only covered all of this information in a matter of like 2 slides. Excuse me. So what I did is I took the information from those 2 slides and made up its whole PowerPoint. In Schoology, it's right under the other PowerPoint. And it also, the information is in that handout from the beginning of the chapter with the skeleton and the skull and the bones and that kind of thing. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So if you remember, a synovial joint is associated with connective tissue and it lines our joints. Well, there's a bunch of different types of synovial joints. And the first one is a pivot joint. And just like its name implies, it allows a pivot type of movement. So here at your elbow, the ability to kind of pivot around like a turnstile. And an amusement park, one of those things that counts people, it kind of, you hang, it's a silver thing usually, and it counts you as you go through. That kind of movement. Your neck does the same thing. Okay, that ability to pivot comes from a pivot joint. The next type of joint is a ball and socket joint. This joint has an end of a bone that has a rounded projection, and it sits inside of a depression formed by other bones. We have 2 ball and socket joints. You have your hip and you have your shoulder. The ball and socket joints allow full range of motion, which means that ability to rotate, so you can do movements like this. The third type of joint is a hinge joint, and just like with the pivot, its name tells you exactly the kind of movement that it allows. It allows the open and close type of movement. So here at our elbow, at our knee, kind of like a hinge on a door, allows it to open and shut. Same thing. So it's called a hinge joint. The next kind of synovial joint is a gliding joint. You're going to find this in your wrists and your ankles. So right here, you have all the bones here in your wrist. All those short bones called the carpals, right? And so they aren't completely stationary. They are allowed to slide and kind of glide just a little bit back and forth. And so that is called a gliding joint. There's not a lot of movement. It doesn't flip open. It doesn't hinge open or anything like that. It just allows a little bit of sliding or gliding motion to allow those bones to move around just a little bit. The next joint is a saddle joint, and if you look on the picture, you can see why it gets its name. They have a picture of a saddle right in front of the joint, but it's your thumb, and it allows this rocking motion up and down and back and forth. So the bone sits right in here, and it's shaped like a saddle, so it's called a saddle joint. The last 2 types of synovial joints are the ones that students tend to have the most difficulty with because of their description. So the first one is a condyloid joint, and this is when an oval-shaped bone fits into an elliptical cavity. So here in your finger, the bone coming down in here kind of has that oval shape coming down into the cavity, and it kind of just sits in, trying to get where I can show you, but can't really position myself. So kind of an oval shaped bone sits down into an elliptical cavity. Similar to ball and socket, but not exactly the same. It does not allow rotation, so that's one way that it's different than a ball and socket joint. And with the ball and socket joint, they have that big projection. That's not the case here. It's just an oval-shaped bone. I'd encourage you, when you're practicing with the skeleton today, to take a look at how the metacarpals sit in against each other, and you'll see what I'm talking about there. And the reason that I said that they sometimes get confused is the description for the one we just talked about used the word an elliptical cavity. But the last type of joint is an ellipsoidal joint, and it does not have that description of an elliptical cavity. So an ellipsoidal joint allows two axes of movement through the same joint. So here, your radius and ulna, you can go back and forth like this, and you can go like this. So it is an ellipsoidal joint. It has nothing to do with elliptical cavities or anything like that. It just allows movement in two axes. All right, so those are the kinds of joints, of synovial joints specifically. The movements that are then allowed, some of these we've covered earlier in the year, maybe with range of motion or something like that. But the first one is flexion. The description of this is the bending of a joint. So if you have your arm straightened and you bend it, another way to look at that is by saying that we're decreasing the angle of the joint. So here, our joint is at 180 degrees, and when we bend it, it's now at 90. So we have decreased that angle. So there's two ways to describe that movement. The opposite of that is straightening the joint or increasing the angle, and that's extension. So if we have our arm here and we want to extend it and straighten it, we're increasing the angle, and that's called extension. Kind of a little twist on that is the plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. If you remember back in chapter 2 when we talked about different areas of the body, we talked about the plantar surface of the foot and how that's like the bottom part of your foot. So if this was my foot and I point my toes down, that's called plantar flexion. If I pull my toes up toward my body like that, that is dorsiflexion. So plantar flexion with my toes and dorsiflexion. It only happens in your toes. The next one, abduction and adduction. We did this when we did range of motion. Abduction is taking something away from the body, like a child is abducted when they're taken away. When we want to add something back to our body and bring it back in toward us, or adding it to our body, that is adduction. So abduction is away, adduction bringing it in close. Inversion and eversion. So if I have my feet on the ground like this and I turn onto the sides of my feet, that is inversion. I've inverted my feet. If I do the opposite and stand on the inside of my toes, that's eversion. So these are my feet. Inversion, eversion. The next one has to do with your hands. And if you remember back again to chapter 2, we learned about the prone position. We learned about the supine position. And these directional movements are named similar to that. When we have our hands supinated, or supination, we have our palm up. If we pronate our hand, we turn the palm down. The way I remember it, you know me and my little, here's how I remember it. If I have my hand supinated, I can hold a bowl of soup in it. But if I have my hand pronated, I cannot hold a bowl of soup in my hand. So supination, pronation. And then circumduction is the circular movement like this, similar to rotation. And then, last but not least, we have protraction and retraction. Protraction is when you stick your head out or a body part out. Retraction is when you pull it away. So protraction, retraction, or protract, retract. And then rotation is movement in all axes. So like here in the shoulder, the ball and socket joint allows rotation to occur by allowing that movement in any direction. And I know that that was a very quick summary of the different types of joints and different types of movements that these joints allow, but we'll review them again tomorrow. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. Otherwise, hope to see you tomorrow.